The word police comes from the Greek word polis, meaning city. The people who would eventually control every city in America were not named after law or justice or protection. They were named after the thing they were built to manage. For the first 202 years of colonial and post-colonial American life, from the founding of Jamestown in 1607 to the year 1838, no American city had a professional police force. There were no uniforms, no badges, no precincts, no patrol cars, no detective bureaus. None of it existed, and yet somehow communities managed to keep order for 2 centuries without any of it. The question no one asks is how, and the answer is the part they would rather you did not think about too carefully. I came to this through a court record. I was researching property law in early New England, tracing how land disputes were settled before the modern legal system existed. I expected to find chaos. What I found instead was a structure so thorough, so embedded in daily life, that it made our current system look like an improvisation. Colonial Americans did not lack a justice system. They had one that worked completely differently, where the community itself was the mechanism of enforcement. And when I started tracing when that system was dismantled and who benefited from the replacement, I found the same pattern I keep finding. Every colony inherited the English common law tradition of communal responsibility. The basic unit was the night watch, a rotating duty shared among citizens. Boston established the first one in 1636, just 6 years after the city was founded. New Amsterdam, which would become New York, followed in 1651. Philadelphia's in 1700. These were not police forces. They were your neighbors, taking turns walking the streets after dark, carrying a lantern and a rattle. If they saw a crime, they raised what was called a hue and cry, a shout that legally obligated every able-bodied citizen within earshot to drop what they were doing and assist. The legal obligation was not on a professional class of enforcers. It was on you. If your neighbor shouted for help and you did not respond, you were breaking the law. Order was not something delivered to the community by an outside force. Order was something the community produced from within itself. Above the night watch sat the constable, an elected or appointed citizen who served warrants, collected taxes, and kept the peace during daylight. It was not a career. It was a civic duty, like jury service. In many towns it was used as punishment because the job was so thankless that people actively avoided it. If you were wealthy enough, you paid someone else to serve your term. This system had problems, and I want to be honest about that. The night watchmen were notorious for sleeping on duty and drinking while they were supposed to be keeping watch. In the South, the primary form of organized law enforcement was the slave patrol, established in the Carolina colonies in 1704. And that is a history of violence and control that deserves its own investigation entirely. I am not romanticizing what came before. I am documenting what was replaced and asking why. But alongside the official structure, something else maintained order that the history books spend almost no time discussing: community enforcement through shame. Every village square in colonial America had a set of stocks or a pillory or both. These weren't relics of medieval barbarism. They were technologies of social control that required something professional policing does not require: a community that knows its members by name. When a man was placed in the stocks for public drunkenness, his punishment wasn't the physical discomfort. His punishment was that every person he knew, every person he did business with, every person whose daughter he might want to marry, walked past and saw him there. The historian Adam Hirsch put it precisely: the sting of the lash was painful, but even worse for community members were the piercing stares of neighbors who witnessed their disgrace and with whom they would continue to live and work. The punishment only worked because the community was small enough for everyone to know everyone else. And that is the detail that matters, because by the 1830s, that was no longer true. Between 1820 and 1840, the population of New York City nearly tripled, from roughly 123,000 to over 312,000. Boston's population more than doubled. Immigrants poured in from Ireland and Germany. Factory labor pulled families out of tight-knit rural communities and dropped them into anonymous urban blocks where nobody knew their neighbors' names. The stocks don't work when no one in the crowd recognizes the man sitting in them. This is the standard explanation for why professional police forces were created. Urbanization overwhelmed the old system. Cities got too big. That sounds reasonable on the surface, but here is where I started paying closer attention to who was asking for the change and what they were asking the new system to protect. In 1838, Boston created the first professional, publicly funded police force in American history. It was modeled directly on Sir Robert Peel's London Metropolitan Police, which had been established only 9 years earlier. The force began with 9 officers who wore distinctive hats and badges, but carried no guns. They protected themselves with 6-foot blue and white poles, and they called for assistance using police rattles. For the first time in America, keeping order was not a civic duty shared among citizens. It became a job performed by a permanent class of professionals. New York followed in 1845. Chicago adopted a force in 1851. New Orleans and Cincinnati did so in 1853. Philadelphia followed in 1855. By the 1880s, every major American city had a professional police department. The old system was gone in less than a single generation. Historian Gary Potter, writing in Time, explained why Boston created its force. Boston was a large shipping and commercial center, and businesses had been hiring people to protect their property and to safeguard the transport of goods from the port. These merchants saw a way to save money. They argued that the cost of maintaining a police force should be transferred to citizens because it served the collective good. Private businesses were already paying for their own security. The creation of a public police force shifted that cost from merchants to taxpayers. The public paid for the protection of private property, and it was sold to them as a public service. Maybe I'm reading too much into this. Maybe the merchants were genuinely concerned about public safety. The standard narrative makes sense. Cities were growing, crime was rising, and something had to change. But then I look at what was actually happening in the 1830s. It was not just urbanization. It was riots. 1834 is described by historians as New York City's worst year for civil unrest, with election violence, mob attacks on abolitionists, and intense physical violence throughout. After the Panic of 1837, rioters stormed warehouses when rumors spread that speculators were buying up all the flour. Labor organizing was accelerating. Immigrant communities were forming power bases that threatened established economic interests. A historian studying early police forces described the logic plainly. The new organizations intervened between the propertied elites and the propertyless masses, who were regarded as politically dangerous as a class. The first professional police forces in America were not created to protect citizens from criminals. They were created to protect property from citizens. And the new police were immediately, spectacularly, corrupt. In New York, the mayor rewarded loyal campaign workers by appointing them as officers. The Tammany Hall political machine used the force to enforce loyalty and suppress opposition. Early policemen did not even want to wear badges, Potter noted, because they had bad reputations to begin with and did not want to be identified. New York's navy blue uniform was not adopted until 1853, 8 years after the force was created, because the officers resisted being visually distinguishable from regular citizens. Consider the timing alongside everything else that changed in the same era. The same decades that replaced community policing with professional police forces also replaced local currencies with national banking, replaced sun-based local time with railroad time, replaced community-based identity with census documentation, and replaced guild apprenticeships with wage labor and company towns. In every case, the pattern is identical. A system maintained by the community was replaced by a system maintained by an institution. Authority that once flowed from relationships between people who knew each other was replaced by authority that flowed from a centralized structure staffed by strangers. The night watch required your neighbor to protect you. The police department assigned a stranger with a badge. The stocks required a community that recognized the man being punished. The jail cell requires only a lock. The constable was elected by the people he served. The police officer was appointed by the mayor who needed his loyalty. And the word itself tells you everything. Police comes from police, not the people in it, not the community, not the neighborhood, but the structure itself, the institution. The thing that replaced the human arrangement with something that could be managed from above. When the old system faded, it did not disappear because people chose something better. It disappeared because the communities themselves were dismantled. The same urbanization and industrialization that made the night watch obsolete also destroyed the tight social bonds that had made it work. You cannot shame a stranger in the stocks. You cannot raise a hue and cry on a block where no one knows your name. The community was the enforcement mechanism. Destroy the community and you create a vacuum. Then fill the vacuum with an institution and tell everyone it was progress. The questions remain. Why did the first American police force transfer the cost of protecting private shipping interests from merchants to taxpayers, and how did that get framed as a public good? Why does every American city build a professional police department in the same decades that replaced local currencies, local time, local identity records, and local economic systems with centralized institutional alternatives? And why did a system of communal responsibility that sustained American communities for over 2 centuries become unworkable within a single generation, at exactly the moment when industrialization was pulling those communities apart? I do not have answers, only patterns. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. If you have made it this far, you already see it. Subscribe, because the next one goes deeper.